My brother demanded I raise his kids like it was my duty, but my wife turned the table with one sentence that shut him down instantly. I'm a 34-year-old guy named David, married to my wife Amy, who's 32, and I've got a decent job that lets us live a comfortable life. We've always enjoyed a quiet, peaceful existence. No kids, just us together, traveling, working, and occasionally seeing family. But everything changed when my brother Chris, who's 36, really started falling apart. Chris has always been a bit of a mess. Growing up, he never really got his life together. He was always the one making bad decisions, never holding down a steady job, always asking for handouts, and generally not pulling his weight. It wasn't that we didn't care about him, but it became clear that he preferred to rely on the family to bail him out whenever things went south. I'm not saying he was a bad person, he just never figured it out. Things got worse when his wife passed away 2 years ago. They'd been married for over a decade, and it hit Chris hard. Losing her wasn't easy for any of us, but it completely knocked the wind out of Chris. He started spiraling even more. His kids, aged 10, 8, and 5, became his only responsibility, and honestly, he wasn't prepared for it. You could see the stress mounting on him as he tried to juggle work, finances, and raising 3 kids on his own. At first, he'd drop hints that he was struggling. He'd mention how difficult it was to manage everything, but it was always half-hearted. He'd laugh it off, like he was just venting. I didn't take him seriously, honestly. I mean, he always complained about something. I didn't think it was my problem. Amy and I, though, we've always been on the same page about not having kids. From the beginning, we both agreed that we didn't want children. We wanted the freedom to travel, focus on our careers, and not worry about the stresses of raising kids. It was a lifestyle we'd chosen together. So, when Chris's financial struggles started getting worse, I reluctantly helped him out a few times. He'd call me in a panic, asking for money to cover bills or get the kids some things they needed, and I'd send what I could, but the calls kept coming. And after a while, I started feeling like a walking ATM. One day, Chris showed up unannounced. I was at home, and Amy and I were having dinner when he knocked on the door. He came in, sat down, and immediately started complaining about everything in his life, work, the kids, bills, how hard it was to be a single parent. Hours passed as he went on and on. Finally, I suggested he try therapy or look for a support group. He didn't seem to take it seriously, brushing it off like I didn't understand what he was going through. Then, during dinner, out of nowhere, Chris said, "You and Amy would make great parents, you know, if anything happened to me." It wasn't said in a jokey way, but I still thought he was just trying to lighten the mood. Amy and I exchanged awkward glances, but we didn't comment on it. I figured it was just Chris being, well, Chris. But a few days later, he started asking us directly, more seriously this time, "Would you take my kids if something happened to me?" I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. I didn't know what to say. I was stunned. The thought of raising 3 kids was completely outside our plan. I tried to explain that Amy and I weren't in a position to take on that responsibility. We didn't want to raise children, and honestly, we felt like it wasn't our job to step in for him. Chris didn't take it well. He tried guilt-tripping me, saying family helps family, and how our life was easy because we didn't have kids to worry about. He made it sound like we were the selfish ones. I could feel the tension rising, but I wasn't backing down. Amy stepped in at that point and said firmly, "We're not going to make a decision like that without serious discussion, especially considering how big a commitment it would be." But Chris wasn't hearing it. He stormed out, calling us selfish and accusing us of abandoning him and his kids. After he left, I just sat there, feeling overwhelmed. It wasn't just him, either. My parents had started putting subtle pressure on me to help Chris. "You're his brother. You need to be there for him," they'd say. They didn't get it. I didn't want my life turned upside down because Chris couldn't handle his own responsibilities. That night, Amy and I talked about it, and she told me we needed to set firm boundaries, not just with Chris, but with the whole family. We couldn't let them guilt us into something we weren't prepared for. I could already feel the weight of the situation dragging me down, but I knew we had to do it. Our life was important too. Things quickly started escalating after our last conversation with Chris. He didn't take our refusal to take in his kids lightly, and I quickly found myself in the middle of a storm I wasn't prepared for. It began with the texts. At first, they were sporadic, just a few messages here and there reminding me of how difficult things were for him. He'd tell me about the kids being upset, about how hard it was to balance everything on his own, and how much they needed stability. I tried ignoring it. I wasn't in the mood for emotional manipulation, but I could see where it was headed. He wasn't going to let this go easily. The next morning, the texts started coming in nonstop. Every time I checked my phone, there was a new message, one after another. Chris pleaded with me to reconsider. He said things like, "The kids love you and Amy. They'd be so happy to be with you. And they need someone who can provide stability." It felt like every other word was stability, and it was starting to feel like a guilt trip more than a plea for help. I didn't respond at first, hoping the messages would stop if I didn't give him attention. But that wasn't enough for Chris. He took things a step further and called our parents, making the claim that I was abandoning my nieces and nephew by refusing to help him. It didn't take long for our parents to call me, asking me to reconsider, reminding me of family duty. It was frustrating. I felt cornered, but I knew I couldn't give in to the pressure. Amy could see how much it was starting to wear on me. She was frustrated too. We'd already made our decision, and yet here I was being dragged back into the same emotional manipulation. Amy kept saying we needed to stand firm, that this wasn't just about me anymore, it's about us as a couple. And I knew she was right. Then one afternoon, it happened. Chris showed up at my workplace. I didn't even know he was coming, and suddenly, I looked up from my desk, and there he was, standing in the doorway. He walked in without knocking and, before I could even say anything, started talking, not even bothering to take a seat. Chris immediately went into full-blown sympathy mode. He started talking about the kids, how they needed someone to look after them, and how they'd love Amy and me as parents. He emphasized that the kids didn't deserve to go through all of this, and that they were just innocent children caught in the middle of a mess he couldn't clean up. He told me that he was doing everything he could, but it wasn't enough. "The kids need stability," he said, "and that's something Amy and you can provide." At that moment, I snapped. I stood up, looked him in the eye, and told him, "You can't dump your responsibilities on me. We don't want this life." The words came out harsher than I intended, but I was done. It wasn't our problem. It wasn't something I'd signed up for, and I wasn't going to let him push us into this corner. I could see his face fall, but he didn't back down. Without warning, Chris broke down in the middle of the office lobby. He started crying right there in front of everyone. It wasn't just a few tears, it was an emotional breakdown, like a scene straight out of a movie. People started looking, and I could feel the eyes of my coworkers on me. The scene was so public, so dramatic, that I almost didn't know how to react. But I couldn't give in, not in front of all those people. I felt guilty as I turned and walked away. I wasn't heartless, but I wasn't going to give him what he wanted. I didn't know if it was the right thing to do, but it was the only thing I could do. I left him there, sobbing in the lobby, and headed straight home. Later that evening, Amy got a call from our parents. They were furious. They couldn't believe how I'd humiliated Chris in front of everyone. They kept saying that I was being too hard on him, and that he was just struggling. My mom even told Amy that she was disappointed in me, accusing me of turning my back on family. It was a lot to take in, and it felt like the pressure was never ending. Amy, though, wasn't having it. She'd had enough of all the family drama and decided it was time to clear the air once and for all. She set up a family meeting for the following weekend, just me, Amy, Chris, and our parents. We needed to get everything out in the open, and it was time to make it clear where we stood. At the meeting, things didn't go much better. Chris immediately started accusing us of letting his kids suffer. He tried to guilt-trip me again, saying we were choosing the easy route while his kids were suffering. It felt like we were stuck in a loop. But this time, Amy wasn't holding back. She dropped a bombshell. She told Chris in front of everyone, "Raising kids isn't something you force on people, it's something you choose." She pointed out how he'd never gotten his life together, how he'd always been financially unstable, and how it was unfair to push this responsibility onto us when we had no part in the mess he'd created. Chris didn't take that well. He stood up, slammed his hand on the table, and stormed out of the room, yelling, "You don't know what it's like to love someone more than yourself." That was the last thing he said before he left, and we didn't hear from him for a while after that. The meeting ended with no resolution, but Amy and I both knew we'd done the right thing. We'd set the boundaries, and now it was up to Chris to figure out his next move. It's been a few weeks since the family meeting, and things have only gotten worse with Chris. After that last confrontation, Chris cut off all contact with Amy and me. No texts, no calls, nothing. For the first time, I felt like there was a chance for some peace. Amy and I went back to our routine, focusing on work, getting a little more time to ourselves. But the tension was still there, hanging over everything. It was hard not to wonder if I'd been too harsh on him. I'd told him no, but was I wrong to refuse him when his kids were involved? Amy reassured me that we did the right thing. She was firm in her belief that we couldn't be dragged into this, no matter how bad things got. Still, I couldn't help but feel guilty at times. The guilt nagged at me. Was I being a good brother? Should I have tried harder to help him? A couple of days after Chris went silent, my parents called me. They told me Chris was talking about giving up custody of the kids because he couldn't cope anymore. The thought of the kids potentially ending up in foster care didn't sit well with me, and I couldn't just ignore it. I decided to call Chris. I needed to know what was really going on. And maybe, just maybe, there was something I could do to help, without getting involved in taking custody. I offered to help him find resources, money for therapy, a parenting coach, or even financial aid for childcare services. It was the only thing I could offer that didn't involve uprooting our lives. Chris's response was sharp and immediate. He accused me of being selfish and told me that I was refusing to step up as the last resort. He claimed that if I wasn't going to take the kids, then I should at least help him keep them, as if that was my responsibility. Now the call ended with him yelling at me about how I was abandoning him and the kids and hanging up on me. That night, Amy called my parents again. We needed to make it clear that we weren't changing our stance. We weren't going to take custody of Chris's kids, and we needed them to stop pressuring us. Amy laid it out plainly. No means no. She wasn't going to let them guilt trip us into something we weren't prepared to handle. Of course, my parents weren't happy with it. They were disappointed and implied that they'd be helping Chris fight for his kids' well-being without us. It felt like they were giving him a pass on his responsibilities again. I had a sinking feeling that this wasn't going to end anytime soon. Then things took another turn for the worse. Chris started spreading rumors to the extended family, telling everyone that Amy and I hated the kids and that we didn't care about them at all. The phone started ringing off the hook with relatives calling to ask why we were refusing to help family. Every conversation felt like I was explaining myself over and over again, trying to set the record straight. It was exhausting. Amy decided it was time to put an end to the rumors and confusion. She called a family meeting, inviting Chris, our parents, and extended family. She was done letting Chris control the narrative, and we needed to make our stance clear to everyone involved. We couldn't keep having these conversations over the phone, so it was time for everyone to hear it straight from us. The meeting didn't go as I expected. Chris walked in with a defensive look on his face, arms crossed, clearly ready for a fight. He immediately started accusing Amy and me of abandoning him and his kids. "You're just letting them suffer," he said. "You could make their lives better, but you're too selfish to even try." Amy didn't hesitate. She stood up, took a deep breath, and let it out. "We will not raise these kids," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It's a huge responsibility, and it's not ours to take. Chris needs real help, not a scapegoat." Chris's face turned red. He started yelling, saying that no one cared about him or the kids, that everyone had abandoned him, and that we were making his life harder. He broke down again, tears streaming down his face. It was the same act as before, and I could see the manipulation for what it was. Amy didn't back down. "Caring isn't enabling," she told him, her voice cutting through the tension. "You need to take charge of your life for your kids. We can't do this for you." We reiterated our boundaries once again. No means no. We couldn't keep going in circles with him. The conversation was over. At that point, things started to split in the family. Some relatives understood where we were coming from, agreeing that Chris needed to take responsibility for his own life and his kids. But others were furious with us, calling us selfish and accusing us of abandoning Chris when he needed us the most. I felt drained. I didn't want to lose family over this, but I also couldn't keep letting them push us into something we didn't want. It felt like every decision we made just caused more chaos, and I was tired of fighting battles on all fronts. But in the end, Amy and I both knew we had to stand firm. We'd made our decision, and no one, no matter how much they pushed, was going to change it. I walked away from that meeting feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. The boundaries had been set, and we'd said everything we needed to say. Chris's actions had led us to this point, and now it was up to him to figure out what came next. A few weeks after our family meeting, everything seemed to settle down. The drama around Chris had quieted, and Amy and I were starting to feel like we could breathe again. But that peace didn't last long. One afternoon, I got a call from my mom. Her voice was shaky, and she told me that Chris had been admitted to the hospital. He'd had some sort of health scare, and no one knew exactly what was going on. She was worried and said it was serious. I wasn't sure what to think. Chris had always seemed like he was in bad shape emotionally, but hearing that something physical had happened made me realize just how far he had fallen. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys and drove straight to the hospital. When I got there, Chris was in a small room, hooked up to IVs, looking drained. He wasn't in great shape, but he was awake. The doctor told me that it was likely the stress from everything going on in his life that had caused the episode. He'd been ignoring his health for so long that it finally caught up with him. Chris looked up when I walked in and gave me a weak smile, but it didn't feel right. He was pale, his eyes puffy from crying, and it was clear that he was at his breaking point. He started talking almost immediately, his voice shaking. "I can't keep doing this. I don't know how to keep going," he admitted. "I feel like I'm failing every day. I'm so tired. I can't be everything for them anymore." I knew this was a turning point, but I couldn't let myself get swept up in the emotion. I sat down next to him and listened. I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the toll this had taken on him. After a while, I gently told him that we still couldn't raise his kids. I reminded him of our boundary. Our decision hadn't changed. But I also told him that I wanted to help him find the resources he needed. "We won't raise your kids, Chris, but we can help you get the support you need." At first, he didn't seem to respond. He just stared at me, trying to process the words. But after a few moments, he nodded reluctantly. "I'll do it," he muttered. "I'll meet with a counselor or whoever can help me." That was a small victory, but it was a start. Over the next couple of weeks, I helped him get the ball rolling. We found a family counselor who could help him work through his emotions and the overwhelming responsibility of being a single parent. I also helped him find a parenting coach, someone who could guide him through the practical side of things, discipline, time management, and how to handle his kids' needs. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. In the meantime, Amy stepped in to help with other aspects. She helped Chris apply for state aid and child care services. We also looked into resources specifically for widowed single parents. Amy was incredible. She did research, made calls, and found programs that would help Chris get back on his feet. It was a team effort, but Chris was starting to see that there were solutions out there. Slowly but surely, Chris began to implement the help he needed. He started going to therapy regularly and meeting with the parenting coach. I could see changes in him, small at first, but noticeable. He wasn't as overwhelmed, and he started organizing his schedule better. The stress didn't seem as suffocating as it had been. It was clear now that Chris never truly wanted to abandon his kids. He wasn't a bad person, but he had been completely overwhelmed, drowning under the weight of everything. The problem wasn't that he didn't care, it was that he couldn't handle it all on his own. A few weeks after all of this started, Chris called me. His voice was different this time, calmer, more collected. He apologized for everything. "I was unfair to you and Amy. I pushed too hard, and I shouldn't have. You guys were right to set boundaries. I was out of line," he said. It was a big step for him, and I appreciated it. The wounds weren't gone, but they were starting to heal. I could tell that he was trying to make things right, and it felt like the tension between us was finally starting to lift. Around the same time, Chris's kids sent Amy and me thank you cards. They didn't know the full situation, of course, but it was a nice gesture. The cards were filled with drawings and little notes saying how much they appreciated everything we'd done for them. I couldn't help but smile. Even though I knew the real work was still ahead for Chris, it was still bittersweet about it all. The fact that it had taken a health scare for Chris to start getting the help he needed made me feel conflicted. On one hand, I was glad that he was taking responsibility for his life. On the other, I couldn't shake the feeling that it shouldn't have taken all of this to get to this point. My parents also came around a bit. They called me to admit that pushing the custody issue onto us was unfair. They didn't exactly apologize, but they acknowledged that we had made the right call. However, they still expressed disappointment that Chris couldn't get things together on his own, and it was hard not to hear that lingering judgment in their voices. In the end, though, Chris seemed to be on the right path. He set new goals for himself, ones that focused on being a healthier, more stable parent. He had a long way to go, but the changes were real. His kids were doing better, and Chris was beginning to see that he didn't have to do it all alone. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was finally taking control of his life, and I was proud of him for that. We weren't out of the woods yet, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were moving in the right direction. Just when it seemed like things were finally starting to settle down with Chris, I received a text from my parents that completely blindsided me. "Chris is thinking of moving to another state for a fresh start." I stared at my phone for a few seconds, trying to process what I had just read. Moving? After everything that had happened? I didn't know what to think. Was this really the right time for him to make such a drastic decision? I called him immediately. The conversation started with a strange mix of tension and confusion. "Why are you thinking of moving?" I asked. "Things were starting to look up for you. What's going on?" Chris's voice on the other end sounded strained, like he was rehearsing his words. "Look, I know I've been doing better, but I just feel like everyone's judging me. I can't escape it. I need a clean slate. I need to be somewhere I can focus on my kids without all the pressure from family." He explained that he was considering relocating to a city that offered better job opportunities, a lower cost of living, and a chance to leave the past behind. It sounded like the typical impulsive decision he used to make, but this time, it felt different. Chris had made progress in his life, And now he was talking about uprooting everything again. The thought of him taking the kids and moving away so suddenly made me uneasy. It was too quick, too impulsive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't thinking things through. What about his support system here? He had just started to find stability, and now he was ready to throw it all away? Amy overheard me talking on the phone and chimed in as soon as I hung up. "He's rushing into something again, isn't he?" she said, crossing her arms. "He's acting like moving is going to fix everything, just like he always does." She was right. It felt like Chris was repeating his old pattern of making impulsive decisions without considering the long-term consequences. That's when I realized I needed to step in again, not to control his choices, but to help him think this through. I arranged to meet Chris for dinner the next day. We sat down at a small restaurant, and Chris began laying out his reasoning. He explained the job opportunities in the new city, how the cost of living would be more manageable, and how he thought starting over would give him a fresh perspective on life. "I get it," I said, cutting him off. "But have you really thought about how this will affect the kids? They're finally starting to adjust. Are you sure this is what's best for them, or are you just running away from everything that's been holding you back?" Chris bristled. "It's not like that," he snapped defensively. "I just need a new start. I can't keep living in the past." "But what about the kids?" I pressed. "They've got friends, school, their whole life here. You've got to think about how this will impact them too." Chris hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the question. "I don't know. I haven't thought about all that, but I know they'll adjust." "Have you really thought it through?" I asked again, trying to make him see the bigger picture. "You can't just make decisions on a whim. Moving is a huge change for everyone, especially the kids. Are you ready for all that?" Amy, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "Chris, why not take a few months to plan it carefully? You're rushing into something that could be a big mistake. Moving doesn't fix everything. You've been making progress here, and I think you need to take the time to make sure it's the right choice." Chris didn't respond right away. I could see him thinking it over, the weight of the decision starting to sink in. "Maybe you're right," he said finally, though I could tell he wasn't fully convinced. He agreed to meet with a therapist again to help him clarify his motivations. He also said he would consult with a financial advisor before making any final decisions. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step in the right direction. Meanwhile, my parents called to express their concerns. They were worried that if Chris didn't move soon, he'd slip back into his old habits. They even hinted that they'd be willing to help financially if he stayed close by, which only frustrated me. It felt like they were trying to rescue him again, and I couldn't stand it. I finally told them, gently but firmly, that they needed to stop rescuing Chris every time he struggled. "He's making progress on his own," I explained. "You can't just swoop in every time he's having a hard time. Let him do this on his own." Chris kept me updated over the next few weeks. He worked with his counselor to ensure that his motivations for moving weren't driven by an impulse to escape responsibility. He applied for jobs in nearby cities, focusing on stability rather than upheaval. Eventually, he made the decision to put off the move entirely. He realized that what he needed wasn't to escape, but to build a more stable life where he was. He continued to work on himself and focus on making steady progress. His kids were doing better in school, they had started making new friends, and things were finally starting to settle into a routine. One evening, Chris called me, sounding calmer than I had ever heard him. "I never realized how much I was avoiding facing my problems until you forced me to," he admitted. "You were right. I've been running away from everything, but now I'm finally dealing with it." I couldn't help but feel proud of him. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't a perfect solution, but Chris had made the right decision for his kids and himself. Looking back, I realized that setting boundaries wasn't just about protecting our own lives. It was about helping Chris take control of his. And in the end, it changed our relationship for the better. He wasn't the same person who had once pushed all his burdens onto us. He was becoming someone who could stand on his own, and for that, I was thankful. A year had passed since everything started to fall into place. Life had finally settled into a new normal, one that was comfortable for Amy and me. Chris had remained steady. He was working a better job, keeping up with his therapy, and gradually becoming the person I had always hoped he could be. It was clear that he had learned to handle the responsibilities of fatherhood on his own, without relying on us to pick up the pieces. The kids were happy and well-adjusted, and Chris seemed more confident than I'd ever seen him. It wasn't perfect, but it was a huge step forward from where we had been. Amy and I would occasionally talk about how things had changed. It wasn't always easy, but we both knew we had played a role in pushing Chris to take responsibility for his own life. We were proud of him, not because we had done it all for him, but because we had set the boundaries that ultimately helped him grow. We hadn't sacrificed our values for his sake, and that meant everything to us. Then one day, Chris invited us to dinner. It seemed like a simple, casual family catch-up, nothing out of the ordinary. I figured it was just an excuse to spend some time together, but little did I know he had a surprise planned. When we arrived, Chris and the kids were already there. It was a cozy setting, with the kids happily chattering away, and everything felt relaxed. We sat down for dinner, and Chris seemed a little more excited than usual. He smiled at us across the table, but there was something else in his eyes, a nervous anticipation. After a few minutes, Chris took a deep breath and made the announcement that caught both Amy and me off guard. He said he had met someone new, a woman named Hannah. She was a teacher he had met through the kids' school events. As he spoke, Hannah walked into the room. The kids immediately lit up and rushed to her, eagerly introducing her as Dad's friend who helps with homework and soccer practice. It was clear that they had already accepted her as part of their lives. Chris went on to explain that he and Hannah had been seeing each other for several months, but had kept it quiet until they were sure things were serious. It was one of those moments when you realized that everything had shifted. Chris wasn't just surviving anymore, he was thriving, and his life was expanding in ways I never thought would happen. Hannah then spoke up, and the room grew quiet. She mentioned how impressed she was with Chris's parenting and the growth she had seen in him. And then, with a soft smile, she added something that caught me completely off guard. "Chris talks often about how you two saved him when he couldn't see a way out," she said. "You gave him the push he needed to turn his life around." Amy and I exchanged looks. We were stunned. We hadn't realized just how much our tough love had impacted Chris until Hannah said that. She was right, though. We had pushed him, but we never expected him to get to this point. To be sitting there, hearing him talk about a new relationship and a future with stability, was more than I ever imagined possible for him. Chris got emotional at that point. He looked at both of us, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't know where I'd be without you two," he said. "Thank you for pushing me to grow and not taking on my burdens. You saved me without even realizing it." It wasn't easy to hear that. It was bittersweet, knowing that Chris had needed to go through all that hardship to get to this point, but it was also beautiful. He had finally come into his own. He'd rebuilt his life, step by step, and for the first time, he was owning it. He wasn't asking anyone else to do it for him. Amy, always the one to lighten the mood, grinned and joked, "Well, Hannah, you definitely deserve a medal for dealing with him." We all laughed, and the tension that had once surrounded our relationship with Chris was gone, replaced with a light-hearted moment of shared understanding. It was a good feeling, one that made the hard times feel worth it. As the night came to an end, Hannah pulled us aside before we left. "I just want to thank you both," she said, looking sincere. "Chris is a completely different person now. You gave him back to his kids, and they're so lucky to have him." It was hard to process everything in that moment. We had done what we thought was best for us, and now here we were, witnessing the incredible impact it had on Chris's life. We hadn't wanted to be heroes, we just wanted to live our lives. But by setting boundaries and standing firm, we had given Chris and his kids a fighting chance. That was something I never thought I'd say, but I couldn't help but feel grateful that it had worked out this way. As we left dinner that night, Amy and I talked about how far Chris had come. It wasn't just the fact that he had found someone new, it was the way he had turned his life around, step by step, with help but without relying on anyone to shoulder his responsibilities. Chris continued to thrive. He and Hannah seemed happy, and the kids were flourishing. They were excelling in school, making friends, and enjoying their time with Chris. The family dynamic had changed, but it had changed for the better. I sat back and reflected on everything that had happened. Setting those boundaries wasn't just about us protecting our own lives. It had also allowed Chris to rebuild his. And that made all the difference. We never asked for any of this, but in the end, it turned out better than I could have ever expected. Sometimes, saying no is the best way to show love. It wasn't easy, but I wouldn't change a thing.